after e4, e5, knight c3, knight f6, and f4, the main move is d5. So after pawn takes d5, in this video we're going to go through pawn takes pawn in f4. So we're equally material, how to go on. White continues with bishop to c4, and we've got two defenders over the two attackers, the queen and the knight on d5. And now let's explore a few ideas. So let's start from the logical, bishop to d6, putting more defense over the square f4, because we will eventually be targeting this pawn with the idea of developing the bishop like that. White immediately gives a check with the queen. And this is going to create a swap of queens, because, well, either black now goes back with the bishop, which doesn't make sense because he went to d6 and then e7. If he does, white wins the tempo. If queen to e7, then d3. We don't need to really swap the queens because the black queen is pinned to the king. So there's no way for black to avoid the swap. A move like bishop e6 wouldn't be possible because we can just take it. Black has to continue development. Knight d6 doesn't make sense since it's blocking the bishop. You can play bishop g4 immediately. And now, yes, we're going to take the queen. And this creates a necessity for black to take with the king, because bishop takes back will allow the white player to go up material with no compensation at all for black. So after king takes, h3 attacking the bishop. After bishop to h5, white finishes development with knight to e2. Well, white still has the castle, so development is not really over. But now we're putting a lot of attack over f4. And now we're going to explore simply two ideas. Well, we're not going to be talking about bishop takes knight, because black gives up the bishop pair and the game is open, so white will have an advantage, quite big advantage, and it wouldn't have made sense for the bishop to retreat in h5 anyway. So the ideas will be these two. g5, kind of thematic in against the King's Gambit and Vienna Gambit. Protect the pawn a bit further. White continues with g3. This is also thematic. We are still just gonna swap everything and take control over f4. The queens are not on the board, so the white king, no king has to worry too much about his safety at the moment. Let's make an example. If pawn takes and bishop takes, pawn in g5 with pinning the knight. And white is much better. White is also threatening to attack the knight further. So if, for example, rook to g8 to attack the bishop, check, king takes, and then castle, white has just got a great advantage. White is much better here. So after the king goes back, let's say to e7, position is evaluated about +3 when the knight goes to f4, attacking the bishop. So taking the knight will just allow the white player to start piling up the rooks. After bishop to g6, for example, white continues with rook check. And after king d7, finally the bishop can be taken. Either way, white will get the rook on the 7th rank and win material. So even if the f7 pawn were to be saved, then still check. And we will start collecting pawns, which is a possibility eventually. If king goes to d8, the best move is actually knight to e4. And the game plays itself. So back in this position, earlier g5 was seen. What happens after the computer move, best move by black, f3? Idea obviously is to break the pawn structure. Well, this pawn still has to be taken. So pawn takes, bishop takes with an attack on the rook, rook to g1, attacking a weak pawn. So after g6, white continues with knight to d4, attacking the bishop. These are all the best moves, basically. It wouldn't have made any sense for bishop to take knight. For instance, the game is open and black has weaknesses, such as in the dark squares, for example, so there's no need to give white such advantage. And if that happens, then it's good on white. After bishop to h5, only square to go to. These are all forced moves. Knight d goes to b5. The idea, obviously, is to give it for that bishop. And there's really no square where the black bishop can go to avoid the swap. So, for example, bishop h2, it will just be attacked. And then we'll have to move again. And if the bishop goes to e5, for example, then simply d4. So after the best move, rook to e8, the most active move, white can take the bishop. So we're gonna go through pawn takes knight. The variation of the king takes knight with the discovered check isn't leading anywhere, because if king takes, then king to d2. It looks weird because it blocks the bishop, but white will develop the bishop from the fianchetto. Right now, white is threatening the very strong b3 with bishop a3 idea, and also knight b5 is a very strong move. So well, if white were to play again, b3 would be the best move. If black tries to develop the knight to d7, developing the knight, trying to finish off the development, the problem of this king d6 move is, yes, black managed to keep the pawn structure kind of safe, but at the same time the king is now more in the center of the board and the development will not be possible. Knight to d7, potentially maybe supported with c5 later on to block the attack of the bishop in a3. It doesn't work because of knight check. And the knight's also attacking the square in c7, where he will be forking two major pieces. So if instead of knight to d7, black plays the more quiet a6 to stop that from happening, white continues with the plan b3 and develop the bishop from the side. By the way, the move b5 doesn't trap the bishop, it looks like, because if black actually takes the bishop, then something worse is going to happen after rook f1, threatening to let the rook join the game with a check. So if pawn takes, then rook takes to check, and after, well, king e7 will be met by knight to e4, defending the rook, giving access to the bishop to a deadly check that allows white to win the endgame. And if the king goes to e5, even worse, white will just already transition to the winning endgame by just taking the point f7. That's the best move. Position is evaluated +8, as if white was almost up a queen. So we can go back to where we were. Back in this position, king shouldn't take in d6. So after pawn takes back, another forcing move, which is bishop to g5, attacks the knight. And after knight to d7, protecting the knight further, white plays king to d2. Obviously, white couldn't really castle because of the bishop. So after king to f8, in order to unpin the knight, white completes it with rook to f1. Rook a to f1. And now we got two attackers over one defender. So after king to g7, white plays bishop to b5, pinning the knight to the rook, and white's about to win material. Black's best move, engine move, is rook e to b8, but then this doesn't stop white from winning material. Bishop takes, knight takes, and now knight e4 attacks the weak pawn in d6. These moves are all forced, so once you've watched this video quite a few times, you'll be able to transition to a winning endgame pretty much every time. And nobody is really prepared against e takes d5 variation of the Vienna Gambit. Let's go on a few moves so we can conclude this line. After f5 attacking the knight, which is the best move, white plays knight to g3. So we ignore the pawn in d6 because we're trying to just win the endgame by dismantling the integrity of black's pawn structure. After black's best move, which is knight f6, to defend the bishop properly, because if black doesn't play that, then taking this bishop, also preparing a discovery attack with a bishop and creating these islands of isolated pawns would be terrible. So after knight f6, white makes use of its dominant position by playing knight takes pawn. So it's a sacrifice. Pawn takes back. Well, that was a check. And after rook takes f5, we've got two attackers over f6. And that's game over. There's nothing black can do. If black protects the knight, then simply bishop takes comes with a double check. So that's pointless. If black moves the knight, then again, bishop f6 is a double check. So the king has got no escape. King f7 will be met by mate in 8. Bishop, starting with bishop to h4. The king can't move anywhere. None of these two squares. So you're going to have to start giving up material. And the checkmate is forced anyway. And from this position, if the king moves to h6, white continues with bishop to d4. And obviously a threat of checkmate from d4. This can be momentarily stopped with bishop to g6. allowing the king space to go to g7. White now plays rook f to g5 and gets ready to play bishop e3. So if black moves, black will have to do something. So black can't really move the bishop because that gives white attacking chances and checkmate chances. After knight to c7, trying to put the rooks back in the game. Bishop to e3, and if the king tries to escape to g7, white plays h4, exploiting the pinned bishop, and the pawn in h7 can't really move because we have two attackers. Position is evaluated almost +7 for white. So let's make a recap. So f4, Vienna Gambit, d5, pawn takes d5, and after pawn takes in f4, white plays bishop to c4. Earlier we went through bishop d6. This time let's go through another very popular move that happens a lot, which is c6. Black tries to speed up the development of the knight, well, to c6. That would be ideal, but of course we're not going to take this pawn. That would be silly. White now continues with d4, putting the pawn in the center. So it looks like now black has got enough attackers to d5. So we're not going to be able to defend that pawn forever. So pawn takes, white continues with bishop to b3. Black was able to win a pawn, but at the cost that one of them is isolated, the other two are doubled up. So after bishop to d3, black's most active moves, bishop to g4, is met by knight to f3. And after bishop to d6, natural development of the bishop, defending the pawn in f4 so that white doesn't take it with development as well. White simply castles. And now black can't really castle because we're threatening to simply win this pawn. So after the logical bishop to c7, allowing the queen more defense over d5, white punishes with queen to e1 check. This move is thematic for the Vienna players and the King's Gambit players because he gets the queen away from the pin, meaning that this knight will be able to go to e5 at some point. After queen to e7, blocking everything, best move by white is knight to b5. And now the queen can't take the queen without giving white so much more development. White's got a check in c7, the development of the bishop in f4, the development of the rook by coming with a check. Black will not even be able to castle. The best move by black is obviously knight a6, defending the bishop in c7, so that the fact that the queen in e7 is pinned doesn't really matter too much. But still, white happily goes on to give the knight for the bishop, and after knight takes back, finally white recaptures the pawn in f4 and is ready to go to a winning endgame. Black's got an isolated pawn, and white not only has a better pawn structure but also the bishop pair. If black wants to try and continue this game, he can try something like knight to e4, the knight's protected by a pawn, and in this case avoid the swap of queens so that black will be able to castle in peace. But this fails simply because bishop takes knight, queen takes back, and then the bishop is able to take the pawn in d5, and the situation is falling apart. So next line, after d5, pawn takes d5, and pawn takes f4, bishop c4. So we went through bishop d6 and c6. What happens after the logical, natural bishop g4 attacking the queen? Knight f3. So assuming that we all understand that bishop takes f3 will be bad because that just helps the smooth development of the white player. Let's look at this idea this time. Black bishop can go to b4, the idea of breaking the pawn structure, especially considering that this knight in c3 cannot be defended by the other knight. White continues with the thematic check. Queen e2 check. Now again, bishop going back to e7 wouldn't make sense because, why would the bishop go to b4 if then it was going to go to e7? It could have gone to e7 in the first place, which is a line we will see later on. Let's mention anyway, if bishop goes actually back, then h3 is the best move. And after bishop to h5, white continues with d3, going to go for the pawn. This line is just bad, right? This bishop b4 and bishop e7 back move it's just bad, right? So it's not really a line worth seeing because it's not a situation that will happen. And if it happens, well, to be honest, I haven't really prepared like a massive repertoire for this situation because it's just black blundering. White will inevitably take in f4. g5 will be completely wrong. The light square bishop has left the queen side, so that means the black will have nowhere to save the castle in case he actually plays g5. So let's go back a few moves. After queen e2, check. Queen blocks. Makes more sense. Okay, white will castle. Again, this queen can't really avoid the swap because it's pinned. So, and now we're going to go on with the move castle. If black were to take the queen, for instance, that will just help the white player targeting the weakness here. Because at the beginning of this opening, we took the pawn in d5, black took in f4. Thing is that we're able to hold the pawn in the control of the pawn d5, but black will not be able to take control over f4. If queen takes and knight takes back, we have now this piece attacking f4, and afterwards, when we push the central pawn, the bishop will be targeting 2. So going back here, we're gonna go to the move castling. Anyway, here white can finally take the queen because that forces black to go backwards. Oh, and by the way, when the bishop was in b4, this specific setups, the idea of taking the knight after the queen facing each other wouldn't stop white from just doing a swap, and then after taking with the d pawn, targeting the pawn in f4 as well anyway. So that was going to be the plan anyway. So after bishop takes back in e7, white continues with d4, going for f4. And this pawn is undefendable. G5 cannot be played because the pawn can just be taken. And if bishop takes knight first, so that the black can play g5, then yes, that is what gives black most chances, but it's still in a losing position. After g5, white goes on with the thematic g3. And white goes on with the bishop pair and material advantage. Well, if black actually takes in g3, for instance, then again, we've seen this type of move before. Bishop takes g5, double attack on f6. And when knight can't really move without losing the bishop, and if the knight tries to protect the bishop whilst moving, so for example, knight to d5, well, let's mention that king g7 is not possible because rook to g3 wins a pawn and a tempo because there's going to be a nasty discovered check, so that's not possible. If knight goes to d5 to keep protecting the bishop, and at the same time the bishop is attacking the undefended bishop in g5, then simply bishop to h6 is the sneaky winner. The bishop is attacking the rook just like the rook is threatening to go to g3. So if the rook moves away from the bishop, white's got that check, and then the king moves, and then this knight will be free. If pawn takes in h1, then in h2, king plays to h1. Of course, taking will give a lot of activity for black. It will be very dangerous. And then nothing really stops rook to g3 with the threat of mate to follow. So let's make a recap so that we can go on to another type of idea. After f4, d5, pawn takes, and then pawn takes in f4, bishop c4, and now we're looking at bishop g4, knight f3. What happens if black is the first one that gives the check? 2, obviously. Two moves are possible now, queen swap and bishop takes f3. Those are the two moves we're going to look at. So let's say, for example, starting from queen e2, bishop takes back. In this case, we shouldn't really take with the knight because, yeah, the bishop in c4 will still be defending d5, but at the same time, bishop takes f3 will create a very ugly pawn structure for white on the king side. So we need to be able to defend the bishop, the knight in f3 with the bishop. So after bishop to d6, putting more protection over f4 and protecting the bishop, h3, bishop h5. We've seen this type of setup before. Let's see what happens in this case if black plays bishop to f5, then simply knight to d4, winning the bishop pair. And if the bishop is stubborn and goes to g6, then knight to b5. So we are going to win the bishop pair or material. So after bishop actually goes to h5 instead of f5, White continues with d4. After castling, knight to b5. The idea to get rid of that bishop so we can take f4. In this case, we're going to look at a setup we haven't seen before. Knight takes d5, which is wrong. The idea is basically to win a pawn and put more defense over f4, but this run into c4. And if the knight goes to e3, I've encountered this move many times in my own games when I play the Vienna Gambit. White continues with c5, he's completely winning. There's a piece hanging, so knight g2 is not recommendable because then after the king moves, there will be another piece hanging, so two pieces hanging, white will win one of them. Knight to c2 going for the rook doesn't work because of simply king to d1. Bishop g6 defending the knight for the moment and also providing the knight the square to go back when he's done taking the rook. Now simply we take in d6. We're up a piece, now we're down the exchange, but now we take the pawn with an attack on the knight, so we're threatening to win a piece for real with promotion basically. So then in that case we will have a material advantage. After knight to c6 and bishop f4, white is completely winning. The pawn in c7 is defended by a minor piece that cannot be attacked, and the fact that the black player might be able to save this knight for the moment doesn't really matter. White's got an incredible asset in c7 now. Just a few moves ago, instead of bishop g6, let's see what happens if black immediately takes the rook. Then again we take the bishop, pawn takes back, and now bishop develops to f4 with a tempo. And besides, the black knight is still trapped. So what happens after a move like knight to c6? Speeding up development, preparing the rook to go to an open file. King d2. Now the rook is attacking the knight. So that should do. After a6, best move, white continues with knight to a3. Best move by black knight, rook f to e8. But still, we're just going to take the knight. Bishop takes, last attempt by black to try and improve the position of his pieces, win maybe some material, but black can take the pawn in d4. And taking in b7 would be a naive mistake because then the bishop might be skewered and black is getting great activity. Let's simplify this game by finishing this line with bishop d5, pinning the pawn in f7, putting the bishop in an excellent position. And let's mention that rook e2 here isn't going anywhere. Check, king to d3, there's an attack on the knight, we're willing to take the knight. So rook a to e8, this kind of like doubling up rooks doesn't work because we can take the knight. And black's best move is knight to e6. The idea is that if we take the rook, there's going to be a disaster. We're going to lose both bishops. White continues with the best move, bishop e3. We're attacking the rook, and the rook's got nowhere to go except b2. But then king to c3, attacking the rook. Rook back to e2. Knight to c4 will finish the job. Every single square on the second rank is now controlled by a white piece. Well, except a2, but it doesn't matter. Rook to c8 pinning the knight doesn't work because king d3 will be able to do what we want. Last recap. So after pawn takes and pawn takes f4, bishop c4, bishop g4, knight f3. What happens if queen e7 check? We said we're going to play queen e2. Earlier we went through queen swap. What happens after bishop f3? This looks better because we're breaking, the black player is breaking the pawn structure. So in fact, we can only take back with the pawn. Black develops the knight in d7. And white goes on with d3. We really have no reason to swap queens at the moment. And after black castles long side because the bishop's blocked and white can finally recapture in f4. And the position of the black player is just much better. Even though the pawn structure doesn't look any good, the game is open enough and white will continue with the bishop pair. Let's go on with few hypothetical very good moves by black so that we can see how to manage this type of setup. As we know, we don't have to worry about the black player swapping queen with us since our pieces are more advanced. If black goes rook to e8, then yes, we're going to be swapping now. The reason is that if black takes with the rook, we can play king to d2, And black will have to waste the tempo for the development of the dark square bishop. Besides, the black player, if he will try to develop the bishop from the fianchetto in G7, then that will create a weakness over the square D6, which is always pushable in such cases. If black takes back with something that looks more natural, which is bishop to E7, white continues with castling longside, and white has a quite solid advantage in this game. Knight to b6 is a typical move, the last move we're going to look at, so that we have explored as many patterns as we possibly could in this video, so that we can master the Vienna Gambit. Knight b6 is a typical move that attacks the bishop and puts more attack over d5. This is ignored whilst white continues with d6, which is also possible in this scenario, even though the bishop is also putting some defense over d6. Black takes bishop is the move we're going to go through now, also because we're threatening bishop to f7. There's absolutely no reason for black to allow this. So after knight takes bishop, we take the knight back. And after bishop takes and pawn takes, white finishes off the line with knight to b5. So back at the original position, the last move I'm going to mention is after pawn takes in f4, bishop c4, and bishop g4, knight f3. Earlier we went through queen check, bishop b4 was also explored. What happens after knight to d7? Another developing move. So white continues with d4, immediately targeting f4. So that's quite logical. After bishop to b4, we've seen how bishop d6 is punished in such type of situation, even though it's not exactly the same situations, but the patterns are the same. Once you learn many lines, as many lines as you can from the Vienna Gambit, you'll always end up playing with a move that you didn't expect to see because it's not a real move, but you'll be able to recognize the pattern. So after bishop to b4, queen e2 check, queen e7, and now white castles. We've seen it before. Let's look at this other type of idea this time. What happens if bishop takes? Okay, then in that case, queen takes. What happens here is that we're forcing the king to move. And now we can recapture. So after knight to b6, attacking the bishop and putting double attack on d5, meaning that when we move this bishop, the black player will finally be able to take the pawn in d5. Then we'll talk about the poison, because after bishop to d3, we're actually completely fine. Knight taking the pawn in d5 is met by knight to e5. White's position is absolutely dominant. We will soon finally take in f4 and have the rook ready to open up in the open file. The knight's also attacking the bishop, and white's already got the bishop pair. So after bishop h5, c4 attacking the knight. Knight b4 will be pinned, so bishop a3 and then c3, so that's stupid. So after knight e3, now black is lost. Knight e3 was the last attempt of the black player to safeguard some, like, the pawn in f4. This doesn't work because we can take in f4. Now we're threatening the knight, but we just have nothing to worry. Even if the knight can be very scary when it's around your king, that knight isn't going anywhere. After knight e going back to g4, protected twice by bishop and knight, white continues with bishop e2. And now the black knight is forced to go to h6. Taking the knight doesn't work because of pawn takes. We have an attack on this knight, and when the knight moves, we will have a free bishop. And if the bishop takes our bishop first, then we can take the knight with check. King to e6 or e8 will be encountered by a fork. Or pawn takes, yes, rook e4, same thing. And if the king goes back to d8, for example, then simply pawn takes, then rook has to go, let's say, g8. And now bishop to b2 defending this pawn, and that's game over. It's going to be easy endgame for white. So after bishop to e2, back at the previous position, knight h6 is met by g4. This pawn is very well protected, and white will be able to push the pawn and win one of the knights. If g5 as a counterattack, attacking the rook, then rook can take the knight, sacrifice, king takes back, and now we're winning material by taking the bishop in h5.